The silver gleamed against white linen as 23 guests raised their glasses to toast American freedom. By midnight, 11 of them would be dead. This is the story of how one enslaved woman's act of resistance on July 4, 1857, became a whispered legend that spread through the Underground Railroad faster than wildfire through Georgia pine. The morning air in Savannah hung thick as molasses, carrying the salt tang of the nearby river and the acrid smoke from the kitchen fires. Phoebe's calloused hands moved with practiced precision across the rough-hewn cutting board, her fingers sticky from the peach preserves she'd been preparing since before dawn. The Ravensburn plantation kitchen buzzed with the controlled chaos of feast preparation. Cast iron pots bubbling over open flames, the steady thud of cleavers against meat, and the whispered conversations of the kitchen staff, who knew better than to speak too loudly when the master's guests were expected. At 24 years old, Phoebe had spent half her life perfecting the art of invisibility. She moved through the plantation's grand spaces like a shadow, serving elaborate meals to families who discussed her fate as casually as they debated the weather. But invisibility, she had learned, was also armor, and armor could become a weapon. The Ravensburn estate sprawled across 300 acres of prime Georgia farmland, its white-columned mansion rising from manicured grounds like something from a fever dream of southern gentility. Mortimer Ravensburn had inherited both the land and its human property from his father, along with a taste for elaborate entertaining that had made his 4th of July celebrations legendary throughout Savannah's high society. This year's guest list read like a roster of the city's elite. Dorothea Ashwortham, whose shipping fortune had built half the warehouses along the Savannah River. Arabella Coldenfield, whose cotton mills employed hundreds of free workers, while her husband's plantation enslaved hundreds more. Phineas Thornmere, the district judge whose courtroom had never seen an enslaved person win their freedom. Leonora Blackridge, whose finishing school taught the daughters of plantation owners to speak French while remaining silent about the screams that sometimes carried on the wind. And Josiah Fairholt, the newspaper editor whose weekly columns praised the civilizing influence of the peculiar institution. They would arrive at 4 o'clock for cocktails on the veranda, their carriages rolling up the circular drive in a parade of polished wood and brass fittings. The women would flutter their fans and compliment Mortimer's roses, while their husbands discussed cotton prices and the latest troubles with difficult enslaved people on neighboring plantations. They would speak of freedom and independence, while surrounded by human beings they owned like livestock. But today would be different. Phoebe had been planning this moment for 3 months, ever since the night she'd overheard Mortimer discussing her sale to a sugar plantation in Louisiana punishment for the crime of learning to read. The words had hit her like a physical blow. The girl's getting ideas above her station. Best to move her along before she corrupts the others. Her 8-year-old daughter, Mercy, would remain in Savannah, another generation bound to serve the Ravensburn family. The poison had been remarkably easy to obtain. Arsenic was commonly used to control rats in the grain stores, and Phoebe's kitchen duties gave her access to the locked pantry where Mortimer kept his various agricultural chemicals. She'd spent weeks calculating dosages, testing small amounts on the plantation's most aggressive roosters, until she found the perfect balance, enough to ensure death, but slow enough that the symptoms would be mistaken for a sudden illness until it was too late. Dr. Elias Hartwell's journal, discovered years later in the basement of Savannah's old medical college, would record his initial confusion. July 4th, 1,857 vacant, called to Ravensburn Estate for what appeared to be an outbreak of summer fever. Symptoms included severe abdominal pain, vomiting, and delirium. Most peculiar that it should strike so many simultaneously. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the kitchen courtyard, Phoebe began her final preparations. The cornbread would carry the smallest dose, just enough to cause illness in the children and elderly. The glazed ham would receive a more generous helping, calculated for the robust appetites of the men. But the crown jewel, the peach cobbler that would traditionally close the meal, would contain enough arsenic to ensure that this 4th of July would be remembered for reasons far different than patriotic celebration. She thought of Mercy, playing in the quarters with the other children, unaware that her mother was about to commit an act that would either free them both or damn them to unspeakable punishment. She thought of her own mother, sold away when Phoebe was 12, and of the countless others who had passed through these kitchen doors with dreams of freedom dying in their eyes. The kitchen staff worked around her in companionable silence, none suspecting that their head cook was methodically transforming a celebration of liberty into an instrument of justice. The irony was not lost on Phoebe using the tools of domesticity to strike back at the system that had weaponized her very existence. But as the first carriages appeared on the horizon, their wheels kicking up clouds of red Georgia dust, one question remained. Would her carefully planned act of rebellion succeed in freeing her daughter? Or would it only ensure that they both faced horrors beyond imagination? The feast was about to begin. Before we continue deeper into this story of resistance and retribution, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if this story of hidden courage speaks to you, hit that like button and subscribe, because the darkest chapters of history often contain the brightest flames of human spirit. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across polished silver as Phoebe ladled the first course into bone china bowls. None of the guests noticed the tremor in her hands. What they were about to witness would forever change how America's elite viewed the enslaved people who prepared their meals and knew their secrets. The veranda thrummed with the gentle hum of cultivated conversation, punctuated by the rhythmic creaking of rocking chairs and the soft clink of ice against crystal. Spanish moss draped the oak trees like funeral shrouds, filtering the late afternoon sunlight into dappled patterns across the wraparound porch, where Savannah's most prominent citizens had gathered to celebrate their nation's independence. Dorothea Ashwortham arrived precisely at 4 o'clock. As was her custom, her midnight blue silk rustling against the marble steps as 2 enslaved footmen helped her from her carriage. At 62, she commanded respect through a combination of inherited wealth and carefully cultivated ruthlessness. Her shipping empire had grown from a single cotton vessel to a fleet of 12 ships, each one carrying the products of enslaved labor to markets across the globe. "Mortimer, darling," she called, her voice carrying the practiced sweetness of Southern gentility. What a perfectly divine afternoon for celebrating our freedoms. The irony hung in the air like the humidity. Phineas Thornmere followed 20 minutes later, his black judicial robes exchanged for a cream linen suit that did nothing to soften his hawkish features. At 57, he had presided over more than 300 cases involving enslaved people, and his verdict had never once favored the enslaved. His legal philosophy was simple: property was property, regardless of the form it took. As the guests settled into their chairs, accepting mint juleps from enslaved servants who moved between them like ghosts, the conversation turned inevitably to business. Cotton prices were strong. The railroad expansion promised new markets. And there was always the question of managing difficult property. "I've had to make an example of 3 runaways this month alone," Josiah Fairholt mentioned casually, swirling the bourbon in his glass. "Sometimes I wonder if we're being too lenient. Perhaps the old methods were more effective." Arabella Coldenfield nodded sagely. "Mother always said that kindness was often mistaken for weakness. A firm hand keeps them productive and content." From the kitchen window, Phoebe watched these conversations unfold with the detached fascination of someone observing animals in their natural habitat. She had served these same people dozens of times, had learned their preferences, their prejudices, their casual cruelties. They spoke about human beings like livestock, debating feeding schedules and breeding programs with the same clinical detachment they might discuss crop rotation. The dinner bell chimed at 6:30, its bronze notes carrying across the plantation grounds like a call to judgment. The guests filed into the dining room, where candlelight transformed the mahogany table into an altar of excess. Phoebe had outdone herself with the presentation. Crystal goblets caught the flickering light, silver serving dishes gleamed like mirrors, and the centerpiece of white magnolias seemed to glow with ethereal beauty. But beauty, Phoebe had learned, often masked the deepest horrors. The first course was a delicate turtle soup, served in bowls that cost more than most enslaved people earned in a lifetime. Phoebe had chosen this dish carefully. The rich, complex flavors would mask any metallic undertaste from the arsenic, while the liquid consistency would ensure rapid absorption into the bloodstream. "My compliments to your cook, Mortimer," Leonora Blackridge remarked, dabbing her lips with Irish linen. "This soup is absolutely divine. Divine." The word echoed in Phoebe's mind as she retreated to the kitchen. How easily they applied religious language to their pleasures, while treating human souls as commodities. The second course arrived without incident. Glazed ham, with bourbon reduction, sweet potato soufflé, and cornbread still warm from the brick ovens. The guests praised each dish while discussing the latest tensions over statehood for Kansas. To them, the question of whether new territories would permit slavery was merely a matter of economics and political strategy. They could not see, or chose not to see, the human faces behind their abstractions. Judge Thornmere regaled the table with stories from his courtroom, each anecdote illustrating his firm commitment to maintaining the social order. A young buck tried to argue that he could read legal documents and therefore understood his rights under the law. He chuckled, cutting into his ham. I reminded him that livestock don't have rights, regardless of any tricks they might have learned. The table erupted in appreciative laughter. Phoebe, clearing empty soup bowls, felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. She thought of her daughter Mercy, whose quick mind had already begun forming letters in the dirt behind the quarters. What future awaited a child whose greatest crime would be the desire to learn? From the servant's perspective, documented later in a letter smuggled north by Underground Railroad conductor Harriet Jacobs, the evening revealed the full scope of Plantation society's moral blindness. They sat surrounded by the people they claimed to own, discussing freedom while being served by hands they had shackled, celebrating liberty while denying it to those who made their luxury possible. As the main course plates were cleared and anticipation built for the famous Ravenspurn peach cobbler, Phoebe noticed the first subtle signs that her plan was taking effect. Josiah Fairholt loosened his collar slightly, complaining of the heat. Dorothea Ashwortham requested a glass of water, mentioning a sudden thirst that wouldn't abate. Small symptoms. Easy to dismiss. The real reckoning was still to come. But as Phoebe carried the final course from the kitchen, golden cobbler, topped with fresh cream, still bubbling from the oven, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. A prickling sensation between her shoulder blades, the weight of unseen eyes. Had her careful deception been discovered, or was paranoia simply the price of revolution? The first scream pierced the summer evening at 8:47. By the time the last spoonful of cobbler was served, 3 guests were doubled over in agony. This was the moment when Phoebe's carefully orchestrated plan transformed from quiet rebellion into a reckoning that would shake the foundations of Southern society. The dining room had taken on the golden glow of sunset, filtered through tall windows that overlooked the plantation's prize-winning rose garden. The sweet scent of magnolia blossoms drifted through the open French doors, mixing with the rich aroma of cinnamon and brown sugar from the cobbler that Phoebe now placed before each guest with steady hands. The Persian carpet beneath her feet muffled her footsteps as she moved around the table, invisible as always, while the conversation flowed around her like water around a stone. "The peach cobbler," Mortimer announced with evident pride. "Made from fruit grown right here on the estate. Phoebe has been perfecting this recipe for years." Indeed she had, but not in the way Mortimer imagined. The first forkfuls were met with the usual chorus of appreciation. Leonora Blackridge closed her eyes in apparent ecstasy. "Absolutely transcendent," she murmured. "There's something different about it tonight, a complexity I can't quite place." The complexity was 3 grains of arsenic per serving, carefully measured and mixed into the sugar glaze that crowned each portion, enough to ensure that this 4th of July would be their last. Phoebe retreated to the kitchen, where the other enslaved workers continued their evening routines, unaware that history was unfolding in the next room. She began washing dishes with mechanical precision, her ears tuned to the sounds filtering through the service door. Normal conversation, the clink of silverware against china, the soft laughter of people who believed themselves untouchable. Then Josiah Fairholt pushed back from the table. "Forgive me," he said, his voice strained. "I seem to have developed the most terrible stomach pain." Dorothea Ashwortham looked up from her cobbler, concern creasing her weathered features. "How peculiar. I was just thinking the same thing myself." Within minutes, the pattern became unmistakable. Phineas Thornmere excused himself to visit the water closet, his face ashen. Arabella Coldenfield complained of sudden dizziness and requested to lie down. One by one, the symptoms cascaded through the dinner party, like dominoes falling in sequence. But what struck Phoebe most profoundly, watching through the crack in the service door, was how long it took anyone to suspect poisoning. These were educated people, many of them well-traveled, yet their first instinct was to blame the heat, the rich food, even a possible outbreak of summer fever. The possibility that their enslaved cook might have deliberately harmed them seemed literally unthinkable. The psychological blindness was complete. Dr. Hartwell arrived at 9:15, summoned by a frantic house servant who had ridden hard to fetch him from his evening rounds. His initial assessment, recorded in his journal, reflected the same cognitive blind spot. Multiple guests presenting with gastrointestinal distress, likely a spoiled ingredient or perhaps contaminated well water, recommended rest and laudanum for the pain. It wasn't until Arabella Coldenfield began convulsing on the parlor sofa that the doctor's expression changed. The violent muscle spasms, the metallic taste several guests reported, the burning sensation in their throats, these were not symptoms of food poisoning or summer illness. "God Almighty," Hartwell whispered, his medical bag trembling in his hands. "This is arsenic." The word hit the room like a physical blow. Suddenly, every enslaved person on the plantation became suspect. Mortimer's face turned purple with rage and fear as he bellowed for the overseer. "Search the quarters, find the poison, someone will pay for this." But Phoebe had anticipated this moment. The arsenic container had been cleaned and returned to its proper place weeks ago. The measuring spoons had been scrubbed until they gleamed. Even her apron had been laundered in lye soap to remove any trace evidence. Justice hides in plain sight. The chaos that followed revealed something profound about the plantation system's fundamental contradictions. The same people who insisted that enslaved people were incapable of complex thought or planning now faced the reality that one of those supposedly simple minds had orchestrated a sophisticated chemical attack. The same system that relied entirely on enslaved labor for every aspect of daily life now had to confront the fact that this dependency made them utterly vulnerable. As guest after guest succumbed to increasingly violent symptoms, the surviving plantation elite found themselves completely dependent on the very people they suspected of trying to kill them. Who would care for the sick if not the enslaved nurses? Who would prepare remedies if not the enslaved cooks? Who would carry messages to fetch more doctors if not the enslaved riders? The irony was not lost on anyone, though few dared speak it aloud. Judge Thornmere, writhing in pain on the drawing room carpet, looked up at the enslaved woman tending to him and asked the question that had been haunting every plantation owner's nightmares. "How long have you been planning to murder us all?" The woman Sarah, who had been Phoebe's kitchen assistant for 6 years, met his gaze with steady eyes. every day, massa, every single day. It was the first honest conversation between enslaved and enslaver that had ever occurred on the Ravensburn plantation. But as midnight approached and the death toll mounted, one question remained unanswered. Where was Phoebe, and how far could she run before they unleashed the dogs? The bloodhounds bayed in the distance as Phoebe clutched her daughter's hand, their bare feet sinking into the black mud of Ogeechee Creek. Behind them, torches flickered through the trees like fallen stars seeking vengeance. The next 6 hours would determine whether Phoebe's act of rebellion would inspire a generation of resistance fighters or end in a public execution designed to terrify every enslaved person in Georgia. The plantation bell had been ringing for 2 hours straight, its bronze voice carrying across the humid night air like a funeral dirge. Phoebe had heard it first while crouched in the root cellar beneath the slave quarters, where she'd hidden Mercy after the dinner party descended into chaos. The 8-year-old girl pressed against her mother's side, her small body trembling not with fear, but with the electric excitement of shared conspiracy. "Are we really free now, Mama?" Mercy whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant shouting and barking dogs. Phoebe smoothed her daughter's hair, feeling the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. Free was a word that existed in the future tense, something to be claimed rather than declared. "We will be, baby. We will be." The creek water was surprisingly warm, heated by the day's sun, and thick with the organic decay of fallen cypress leaves. Every step released clouds of silt that swirled around their ankles like smoke. Phoebe had chosen this route carefully. The waterway would mask their scent from the tracking dogs while leading them toward the railroad depot 15 miles downstream. If her timing was correct, the northbound freight train would pass through at dawn, and conductor Samuel Richards, a known Underground Railroad operative, would be watching for refugees. But first, they had to survive the night. The manhunt had begun within an hour of Dr. Hartwell's diagnosis. Mortimer Ravensburn, despite his own worsening symptoms, had organized search parties from neighboring plantations. The death toll had reached 8 by midnight, and the survivors' fury burned hotter than their fever. They understood now that they had been living with a predator in their midst, someone who had studied their habits, learned their weaknesses, and struck with surgical precision. Sheriff Marcus Whitfield's official report, filed 3 days later, would note, "Never in 20 years of law enforcement have I encountered such a calculated and methodical crime. The perpetrator demonstrated knowledge of chemistry, timing, and human psychology that suggests extensive planning and remarkable intelligence." The compliment was unintended, but Phoebe would have appreciated the recognition. The first search party passed within 50 yards of their hiding spot around 1 o'clock in the morning. Phoebe pressed herself and Mercy flat against the muddy creek bank, Spanish moss, providing camouflage, while mosquitoes feasted on their exposed skin. Through the tangle of vegetation, she could see the wavering torchlight and hear the voices of men she had served countless meals, men who now spoke of her with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. "Whoever planned this knew exactly what they were doing," one voice carried across the water. "This wasn't some crime of passion. This was warfare. Warfare." The words settled into Phoebe's consciousness like a key finding its lock. That's exactly what it was. A single battle in a war that had been raging since the first slave ship reached American shores. She had simply chosen her weapons more carefully than most. The creek led them through a landscape that seemed designed by fever dreams, twisted trees draped in ghostly moss, the occasional splash of an alligator or large fish, and the constant symphony of night sounds that could mask a footstep or amplify a heartbeat depending on your state of mind. Mercy proved surprisingly resilient, matching her mother's pace without complaint even as the miles accumulated and their feet grew numb from the cold water. At 3:30, they encountered their first major obstacle, a logging camp where the creek narrowed to pass beneath a wooden bridge. Lamplight spilled from the workers' quarters, and voices suggested that word of the manhunt had already reached this remote outpost. Phoebe could make out fragments of conversation about reward money and the unprecedented nature of the crime. "They're saying she killed near a dozen white folks with poison," one man was explaining to his companions. "Smartest thing any slave ever did, if you ask me. Took real planning." The comment earned nervous laughter, but Phoebe heard something else in their voices, a note of admiration mixed with fear. Word was already spreading, and the story was growing with each telling. She was becoming something more than an individual criminal. She was becoming a symbol. But symbols, she knew, were often martyred to prove their point. They skirted the logging camp by climbing onto the muddy bank and crawling through thick underbrush for nearly half a mile. Thorns tore at their clothing and skin, but they moved in absolute silence, communicating through touch and shared breathing. When they finally slipped back into the creek on the far side of the camp, Phoebe felt something shift in the air around them. They were no longer just running from their past. They were running toward their future. Dawn was still 3 hours away when they reached the railroad depot. But already the eastern sky showed the faintest hint of gray. The small wooden station sat beside the tracks like a sleeping guardian, its windows dark and welcoming. But as Phoebe studied the building from their hiding place in a stand of pine trees, she noticed something that made her blood freeze. Fresh horse tracks in the mud around the platform. Multiple riders arrived recently. Someone had anticipated her destination. The trap was already set. 6 horses stood tethered behind the depot, their breathing visible in the cool morning air. The bounty hunters had been waiting for hours. What happened next would reveal the true cost of resistance in a society built on the systematic dehumanization of an entire race. The wooden platform creaked under the weight of settling timber, its weathered boards still damp with dew that caught the first pale rays of sunrise. The metallic scent of railroad tracks mixed with the sweet decay of honeysuckle vines that had overgrown the station's eastern wall. Phoebe pressed her palm against the rough bark of a longleaf pine, feeling the sticky resin cling to her skin as she studied the trap that awaited her. The bounty hunters had chosen their positions well. 2 men crouched behind the water tower, their rifle barrels glinting in the growing light. Another pair flanked the freight platform, while the remaining 2 had positioned themselves near the ticket office. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who made their living hunting human beings. And Phoebe recognized their leader immediately, Buck Morrison, a notorious slave catcher whose reputation stretched from Charleston to New Orleans. Morrison had earned his fearsome standing through a combination of ruthless efficiency and theatrical cruelty. His standard practice was to capture runaways alive when possible, then stage public punishments that would be remembered for generations. The scars he left were intended to be read like advertisements, warnings carved into flesh that proclaimed the futility of resistance. But Morrison had never hunted prey like Phoebe before. A freight train's whistle echoed across the pine barrens, still miles away but approaching steadily. In her hiding place, Mercy stirred against her mother's side, her small fingers clutching the torn fabric of Phoebe's dress. The child had maintained remarkable composure throughout their desperate flight, but exhaustion was finally taking its toll. "Mama," Mercy whispered, so quietly that even Phoebe had to strain to hear her. "Are those men waiting for us?" The question pierced through all of Phoebe's careful planning and strategic thinking, cutting straight to the heart of what this moment really meant. She was about to sacrifice everything, her life, her freedom, possibly even her daughter's future, for the principle that some actions were worth any consequence. The dinner party had been her declaration of war against a system that treated human beings as property. This railroad depot was where she would either claim victory or accept martyrdom. "Yes, baby," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "But that doesn't mean we surrender." The locomotive's approach grew louder, its rhythmic chugging joined by the screech of metal wheels against iron rails. Phoebe calculated distances and timing with the same precision she had applied to measuring arsenic doses. The train would slow as it approached the depot, but wouldn't stop unless signaled. Samuel Richards would be watching for refugees from the freight car designated for Underground Railroad passengers, but he wouldn't be expecting a full-scale ambush. Morrison stepped onto the platform, his spurs jingling against the wooden boards. At 53, he commanded respect through a combination of physical intimidation and psychological warfare. His left hand bore the scars of a knife fight with a runaway in Alabama, while his right never strayed far from the Colt revolver that had ended more than 30 lives. "I know you're out there, Phoebe." His voice carried across the depot grounds like a challenge thrown down at a medieval tournament. "Smart woman like you, poisoning all those fine folks." That took real planning, real intelligence. The compliment felt more dangerous than any threat. From contemporary accounts preserved in the Morrison family papers, discovered in 1968 during the renovation of a Charleston mansion, came this telling detail. Buck always said that hunting the smart ones was like playing chess with the devil. They made you think 3 moves ahead, and sometimes they'd surprise you with moves you never saw coming. The train rounded the final curve, its massive black engine pulling a dozen freight cars through the morning mist. Steam billowed from its smokestack like the breath of some industrial dragon, and the sound of its approach drowned out all other noise. This was Phoebe's moment of decision. She could surrender and face whatever horrors Morrison had planned for her. She could attempt to reach the train despite the overwhelming odds, or she could choose a third option, one that would ensure her daughter's freedom while cementing her own legend. Phoebe stood slowly, her decision crystallizing with the clarity that comes only in moments of absolute crisis. She had poisoned 11 people to make a statement about the humanity of enslaved people. Now she would make another statement about the power of sacrifice. "Stay hidden until they're gone," she whispered to Mercy, pressing a small leather pouch into the child's hands. "Then find the Underground Railroad station in Jacksonville. Tell them what your mama did and why. Courage chooses its own battlefield." She stepped into the clearing with her hands raised, walking toward the depot platform like a condemned prisoner approaching the gallows. But there was nothing defeated in her posture. She moved with the dignity of someone who had already won the only victory that mattered. Morrison smiled as he watched her approach, but it was the smile of a hunter who suddenly realizes his prey might have been leading him into a trap all along. What neither of them could see was the small figure slipping away through the morning shadows, carrying a story that would spread through the Underground Railroad faster than wildfire through summer grass. The iron shackles bit deep into Phoebe's wrists as Morrison dragged her toward the courthouse steps. By noon, half of Savannah would witness what happened to enslaved people who dared fight back. This moment would transform Phoebe from an individual criminal into a symbol that would haunt the dreams of slaveholders across the South for generations. The courthouse square buzzed with an energy that felt electric, crackling with the tension of a community confronting its deepest fears. The red brick courthouse, built with enslaved labor just 15 years earlier, cast long shadows across cobblestones, still slick with morning dew. The metallic tang of fear sweat mixed with the sweet scent of Confederate jasmine climbing the building's columns, while the rough texture of hemp rope coiled in the hands of men who spoke of justice but planned spectacle. Word had spread through Savannah faster than yellow fever in summer. By 10 o'clock in the morning, crowds had begun gathering in the square. Plantation owners, merchants, housewives, children excused from their lessons to witness what civic leaders promised would be an educational demonstration. They came not just to see punishment delivered, but to reassure themselves that their world remained stable, that the natural order could not be overturned by the actions of one woman. But Phoebe's capture had revealed fractures in that supposed stability. Morrison had expected to find a broken woman, desperate and terrified after her failed escape attempt. Instead, he discovered someone who seemed almost relieved to have reached this moment. During the 3-hour journey back to Savannah, shackled in the back of his wagon, Phoebe had maintained a dignity that unnerved even his most experienced men. She just stared straight ahead, Morrison would later tell his drinking companions at the Planters Club, "Never begged, never cried, never asked for mercy. Made my skin crawl, if I'm being honest." The interrogation had begun at dawn in the courthouse basement, a windowless stone chamber that had witnessed countless confessions extracted through methods the law preferred not to acknowledge. Judge Thornmere, despite his own lingering symptoms from the poisoning, had insisted on overseeing the questioning personally. The irony was not lost on anyone present. A man barely recovered from Phoebe's attack now held her fate in his hands. "We need names," Thornmere had demanded, his voice still hoarse from the night of retching. "Who helped you? Who taught you about poisons? What other plots are being planned?" Phoebe's response had been silence so complete it seemed to absorb sound from the room itself. The tools of interrogation were displayed methodically. The leather whip with 9 tails, the heated iron brands bearing letters that would mark her as a murderer for life, the thumbscrews imported from a London supplier who specialized in what he diplomatically termed correctional instruments. Each implement represented a different approach to breaking the human spirit. But something unprecedented was happening in the world beyond the courthouse basement. Stories spread through the Underground Railroad. Underground Railroad conductor Harriet Jacobs, writing in her diary 3 weeks later, captured the transformation. The name Phoebe has become a whispered prayer among enslaved people from Virginia to Louisiana. Children who have never tasted poison know the recipe she used. Women who have never held a weapon speak of her courage. She has become proof that resistance is possible. The authorities understood this dynamic and tried desperately to control the narrative. Newspaper editor Josiah Fairholt, one of the few dinner party survivors, penned editorials describing Phoebe as a rare aberration, a woman driven mad by exposure to dangerous chemicals. His columns insisted that her actions represented no broader threat to the institution of slavery. But enslaved people throughout the region were drawing different conclusions. Kitchen servants began studying the families they served with new intensity, noting habits and weaknesses that had previously seemed irrelevant. Field hands whispered about plants that grew wild in the woods, discussing which ones might cause illness and which ones might cause more permanent solutions. How slaves found excuses to linger near conversations about security measures, memorizing patrol schedules, and weapon storage locations. The psychological warfare was working in both directions. As news of the failed interrogation spread, plantation owners throughout Georgia began experiencing what one contemporary journal described as acute anxiety regarding domestic arrangements. Meals were left untouched. Water sources were tested repeatedly. Previously trusted enslaved workers found themselves under constant surveillance. Judge Thornmere, frustrated by Phoebe's continued silence and increasingly aware that his harsh methods were only enhancing her reputation, made a decision that would prove catastrophic for the cause he claimed to serve. The execution would be public, elaborate, and designed to demonstrate the consequences of rebellion so graphically that no enslaved person would ever again consider following Phoebe's example. But as the sun climbed toward its noon apex and crowds gathered in the courthouse square, one question hung in the humid air like smoke from a distant fire. Would watching Phoebe die crush the spirit of resistance she had ignited, or would it transform her into something even more dangerous than a living rebel, a martyr whose memory could never be killed? The gallows stood ready, its wooden beam casting a shadow that seemed to point directly toward the slave quarters on the edge of town. The rope snapped taut at 12:43 in the afternoon, but Phoebe's final words had already begun their journey across a continent. What she said in her last moments would echo through slave quarters from Virginia to Texas for decades to come. This execution was meant to end a rebellion, but instead it would prove that some flames grow stronger when you try to extinguish them. The courthouse square held nearly 800 spectators by the time the death warrant was read, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and civic righteousness. The summer heat had turned the cobblestones into radiators, sending waves of distortion dancing above the crowd. while the smell of unwashed bodies, mixed with the cloying sweetness of magnolia, blossoms from the nearby gardens. The rough wooden gallows, hastily constructed during the night by enslaved carpenters who understood the bitter irony of their task, creaked ominously under the weight of its deadly purpose. Judge Thornmere had spared no expense in orchestrating what he termed a lesson in the consequences of betraying Christian hospitality. The platform stood 8 feet high, ensuring that every person in the square would have an unobstructed view of what happened to enslaved people who dared strike back at their oppressors. A brass band from the local militia had been positioned near the courthouse steps, ready to play patriotic hymns that would transform execution into celebration. But something was wrong with the crowd's energy. Among the white faces gathered to witness justice, there were pockets of uncertainty, whispered conversations that died when others approached, glances that seemed to question whether this spectacle served their interests or undermined them. The poisoning had revealed how dependent they were on people they claimed to own, how vulnerable their entire way of life was to the very individuals they treated as property. More disturbing still were the enslaved faces scattered throughout the crowd house, servants accompanying their owners, drivers waiting with carriages, vendors selling refreshments to the bloodthirsty audience. Their expressions showed no fear, no submission, no acknowledgement that Phoebe's fate awaited anyone who followed her example. Instead, there was something that chilled observers to the bone: anticipation. They had come to witness the birth of a martyr. At 12:30, Morrison led Phoebe from the courthouse basement, her shackles clanking against the stone steps like a funeral bell. 3 days of interrogation had left visible burns on her forearms, where heated irons had sought to extract confessions, deep cuts across her back from the 9-tailed whip, bruises that painted her face in shades of purple and yellow. But she walked with a steadiness that seemed to draw strength from the very injuries intended to break her. The crowd fell silent as she mounted the scaffold. This was the moment they had come to see the proud woman reduced to a trembling wreck, begging for mercy that would not come. Instead, Phoebe surveyed the assembled faces with the calm assessment of someone taking inventory. "Any last words?" Judge Thornmere called from his position beside the gallows, his voice carrying clearly across the square. What happened next would be debated in Southern drawing rooms for generations. Phoebe stepped forward, her chains preventing her from raising her arms but not silencing her voice. When she spoke, it was not to the white faces gathered to watch her die, but to the enslaved people scattered throughout the crowd. "Tell your children," she said, her words carrying with startling clarity, "that their mama was not property. Tell them that freedom tastes like arsenic when you're brave enough to season it right." The execution was swift, but her words had already begun their journey. Underground Railroad conductor Sarah Bradford, writing from Philadelphia 2 months later, documented the immediate impact. Every station from here to New Orleans reports the same phenomenon. Enslaved people are arriving with Phoebe's story, and their arriving changed. They speak of her not as someone who died, but as someone who showed them how to live. The authorities had anticipated that the public execution would serve as a deterrent, demonstrating the futility of resistance through overwhelming force. Instead, they had created the most effective piece of abolitionist propaganda in American history. The image of a woman who chose death over submission resonated through enslaved communities with a power that no sermon or political speech could match. Within weeks, Phoebe's poison became a code phrase among Underground Railroad operatives. Kitchen workers began leaving small amounts of arsenic in visible locations not to use, but as symbols of defiance that reminded their enslavers how easily the relationship between oppressor and oppressed could be reversed. More importantly, her execution had revealed a truth that terrified Southern society. The system only worked when enslaved people chose to participate in their own oppression. But as news of Phoebe's death spread north and south along the hidden networks of resistance, one question haunted the plantation houses of Georgia. If one woman could poison 11 people at a dinner party, What could 1,000 women accomplish if they decided to coordinate their efforts? The gallows had been built to end a story, but instead, it had written the first chapter of a much larger rebellion. Mercy found the Underground Railroad station in Jacksonville exactly as her mother had instructed, carrying a story that would transform American resistance forever. Within 5 years, similar poisoning incidents had been reported at plantations across 7 states. What began as one woman's desperate act of revenge had evolved into a systematic campaign of resistance that would help tear apart the institution of slavery itself. The Jacksonville Safe House sat behind a seamstress shop on Bay Street, its location marked only by a yellow ribbon tied to the hitching post, a signal known to conductors and refugees throughout the Underground Railroad network. The scent of lye soap and fresh cotton drifted from the shop's front windows, while the texture of worn wooden steps bore the footprints of hundreds who had passed through on their journey to freedom. 9-year-old Mercy climbed those steps 3 weeks after her mother's execution, clutching the leather pouch Phoebe had pressed into her hands during their final moments together. Inside the pouch was something more valuable than gold: Phoebe's handwritten notes on poison preparation, dosages, and timing, along with a detailed map of every plantation kitchen between Savannah and Charleston. Station Master Ruth Caldwell, a free black woman who ran the seamstress shop as cover for her Underground Railroad activities, recognized immediately that she was holding revolutionary instructions. The notes were written in a careful hand, with measurements precise enough to ensure effectiveness while minimizing the risk to the person administering the poison. "Your mama," Ruth told Mercy, studying the documents by candlelight. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was teaching others how to fight back. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. Copies of Phoebe's notes spread along Underground Railroad routes faster than cholera through a crowded city. Within months, enslaved cooks from Virginia to Louisiana were studying the techniques, adapting them to local conditions, and passing the knowledge to trusted allies. The psychological effect proved even more powerful than the practical applications. Frederick Douglass, writing in his autobiography published in 1861, captured the transformation. The name Phoebe became a whispered benediction among enslaved people throughout the South, not because they all intended to follow her exact methods, but because she had proven that the powerless were not truly powerless. She had demonstrated that intelligence, patience, and courage could level any playing field. But the authorities were learning too. By 1859, plantation owners across the South had implemented unprecedented security measures around food preparation. Kitchens were locked and guarded. Ingredients were tested before use. Enslaved cooks found themselves under constant surveillance, their every movement monitored by overseers trained to detect signs of rebellion. The paranoia was destroying the very system it was meant to protect. Judge Thornmere, in a private letter to his brother, discovered decades later in a Virginia attic, described the psychological toll. "We have created a society where we dare not eat food prepared by the people we claim to own, cannot sleep soundly in houses maintained by people we refuse to trust, and live in constant fear of those we insist are inferior to us. Phoebe may have died on my gallows, but she is winning this war." The final irony was that Phoebe's greatest victory came not through violence, but through the questions her actions forced white society to confront. If enslaved people were truly the childlike, simple-minded beings described in pro-slavery propaganda, how could one woman orchestrate such a sophisticated attack? If the institution of slavery was truly beneficial to enslaved people, why did they celebrate Phoebe as a hero rather than condemn her as a murderer? If white superiority was a natural law, why did it require such elaborate systems of violence and surveillance to maintain? The questions multiplied faster than the authorities could suppress them. Mercy grew up to become a teacher in Philadelphia, founding a school for freed enslaved people where Phoebe's story was taught as both history and inspiration. She never married, dedicating her life to ensuring that her mother's sacrifice would be remembered not as an isolated act of desperation, but as the opening movement of a larger symphony of resistance. The school's enrollment records, preserved in the Pennsylvania Historical Society, show that by 1865, over 300 former enslaved people had passed through Mercy's classroom. Each graduate carried Phoebe's story with them as they built new lives in freedom, ensuring that her legacy would outlive the institution she had died fighting. The Civil War, when it finally came, was fought by armies that included thousands of soldiers who had grown up hearing whispered stories about a woman who chose death over submission. Union officers reported that formerly enslaved men, fighting in colored regiments, often went into battle, carrying small pouches of herbs and roots, not for their medicinal properties, but as talismans connecting them to Phoebe's memory. Her story had become larger than history. But what would you have done, faced with the choice between complicity and resistance, between the safety of silence and the danger of speaking truth to power, between preserving your own life and potentially saving your child's future? These questions echo through every generation that has faced systematic oppression, making Phoebe's story as relevant today as it was in 1857. Some say her spirit still walks the ruins of the Ravensbourne Plantation, now overgrown with kudzu and forgotten by most tourists who visit Savannah's historic district. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.